Thank you for letting me share that. That movie personally makes me smile and think about all the fun things that we can be thankful for. And I also just really appreciate the way he frames certain things, especially about, making mistakes and forgiveness and let's move on and we got to learn and grow. And I think that's an excellent frame for this conversation that we're having tonight of, it could be potentially uncomfortable for folks if you haven't had this conversation before, and just thinking about how we can be courageous and provide space, and that there are simply like no silly or stupid questions. We all have to learn somehow, and hoping to provide that for you guys tonight. So as part of our thankfulness practice, if you guys are willing and want to, in the chat, if you could just put a couple of things you're thankful for and share it with the group, um, I think that would be awesome. I know a lot of things in our lives we tend to take for granted, but I think being in quarantine and being in our homes and our spaces and with everything that's been going on in the world, it's nice to like take a moment and think about what we are thankful for and grateful for. So kind of our way to center ourselves and start this conversation. Let me get my notes. My fluffy dog who really needs to be groomed. Oh, I love that. Family, the weather. Let's see what else we got. My health, my safe, cozy home, gorgeous weather, bright colors, family, friends, a good night's sleep. Awesome. These are really great, guys. Flowers. Cool. Nature. Yeah, we got a lot of things we can be thankful for. And one of the things we can also be thankful for is the youth and the teens in our lives. I know every day I personally just learn so much from the kids that I work with, and the people, my coworkers who also work with kids and hearing their stories, also just the kids in my own personal life, my friends' kids and things like that. I learned so much. Yeah, so someone said even just extra time with their kids during quarantine, being safe at home, healthcare workers. Yep, great. Those are all awesome, awesome things. So thank you for sitting with that and watching that and just sitting and kind of grounding ourselves in this conversation. One of the things too that I would also want to just acknowledge is we are having a conversation about LGBTQ plus population group people, specifically youth, and how we as adults can support them. And just calling out that it's June right now. So if you're unfamiliar with what June kind of stands for the LGBTQ community, it is, most people know it as Pride, and Pride celebrations happen in this month. The reason for that is obviously back in the 1960s, there was the protests around Stonewall, or in Stonewall, and those were led by Black trans women. So just wanting to call that out, as well as like a history of where we started in this topic, and also looking forward to where we're going. We have a lot of work still to do, but it's awesome that we're here now and able to have this conversation with you guys. One of the things that I've been thinking about, since a lot of us in our personal lives and in our work lives and professional lives have also been having a lot of potentially uncomfortable conversations about race and what's happening in the United States right now and in the rest of the world, and wanting to just acknowledge that, and that this conversation feels like it's pretty similar in a lot of ways, in the sense that folks are learning and finding spaces to educate themselves, and just wanting to create that space to move forward. So if we mess up, if I mess up, help me learn if I need to, and together we just learn and continue to move forward. So wanting to open up that space too, in terms of your guys' questions and things like that. So I don't know.
Can I just add to that, Delaney?
Yeah,
I was looking on that too, and that part of the ways in which I find these it to be similar is that I'm discovering, or I'm doing some work and realizing that I didn't know as much as I thought I did. I thought I was pretty accepting, and I sort of knew what was going on, and I'm spending a lot more time now listening, and I think a lot of people are doing more listening and are really kind of opening their minds to what they maybe didn't know, even though they thought they were pretty aware of things. So I'm appreciating that about this moment. And I think, as you mentioned, that applies to the LGBTQ plus community as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that if you don't So like thinking about your own life and your who you know and who you see and who you work with and who you just surround yourself with. If you look at those people and you don't know or don't see anybody who's in the LGBTQ community, most likely they're there. They just haven't talked to you about it yet. So just kind of thinking about that and being mindful of, the space isn't to sort of discuss or debate whether or not LGBTQ people exist. They do. We're kind of, past sort of that. And if you sort of feel that way that they don't exist, the internet might be a good space. We'll talk a little bit about that. But these people are people we encounter and work with in our daily lives. Most likely there's somebody you know. If it is not a youth that you are a parent of, it could be one of their friends. And how do we sort of just work through this together and learn and provide accepting and welcoming spaces in our community? So I don't know, do you want me to share the PowerPoint?
I think I can do it here. I'll share.
Sure. Thank you. Yeah. So I'm assuming you guys can still see me, even though I can just see the PowerPoint. So a couple of common themes that I know that have come up in working with parents and working just even with other adults when it comes to the LGBTQ community and in youth are these on the screen right here. So acceptance, education and information, gender expression, conversations and trust, how do we build those, dating and relationships, how that is very similar or might look slightly different, social media, and then the internet. So these are kind of the common themes I wanted to touch on today with you all. If you guys have anything else that you want to make sure that we cover, again, please use the Q&A feature so that we can go through that and make sure. So just in general, the most key important piece of acceptance. So, Bonnie started off with our conversation of what does unconditional love look like to you? And a lot of you guys provided really insightful responses. And the sort of key thing that a lot of this hinges on is acceptance. So the Washington State Healthy Youth Survey is an anonymous survey that we use in our state to gather demographic information, population information, thoughts, feelings, whatnot of youth in our community. It's done in multiple grade levels and it's done every 2 years. So this is from the 2018 Healthy Youth Survey. And the data point that I wanted to sort of bring up is among schools that have administered the optional survey questions. So specifically the questions around gender and sexual orientation, those are optional. Schools can choose to administer or not. Relative to their straight peers, students who identify as lesbian, gay, or bisexual, or any of the other identities we'll talk more about, report more than double the rates of considering suicide and attempting suicide. So 49% of LGBTQ youth consider suicide, so it's about half compared to 19% of the rest of the population, and then 22% versus 7% in terms of attempting suicide. So that is something that obviously it's very heavy, and we want to figure out how can we help prevent this from happening? How can we support these youth? And acceptance is the main thing. So when it comes to preventative factors and risk factors, if you all are familiar with that sort of terminology, it's basically what are the things we already have that will help support and sustain us, and then what are some things that we can encounter as human beings that might make things a little bit harder or more challenging. So like some protective factors might be a lot of the things you guys listed for as things you're grateful for or thankful for. Our homes, having the ability to live in a home, having family members that support us, having spaces to be by ourselves if we need it, also just education and access to education, certain things like that are protective factors. And then our risk factors are other things that are similar to that too. A lot of it is systemic as well, or personal interrelationship of risk factors could be like not having access to a safe home, not having access to education that fits our needs, not having access to medication or healthcare, not having access to a variety of different things. So those preventative factors and those risk factors are really important. And when it comes to LGBTQ youth, the biggest factor is family acceptance over family rejection. So whether or not the family of this youth or teen or this person accepts them unconditionally, even if it's they need to learn and mess up, You know, they just have to try to figure it out. Just the fact of saying, I love you, I care about you, let's figure this out together. That is what kind of hinges on a lot of this. So you can definitely have LGBTQ youth that don't have the family acceptance, and they still can be thriving individuals. I'm not saying this is sort of the end all be all in any way, because people are complex human beings. And not saying, you know, acceptance makes everything perfect and, you know, we don't have to worry about any of those things. Not saying that either, but it is one of the key factors in thinking about how do we work with the LGBTQ community so that we don't have, or we can sort of address some of the things like of the homeless youth in our country, LGBTQ youth are the largest demographic of homeless youth. And then when you add on top of that too, being LGBTQ and a person of color, that even makes things a little bit more challenging. Also, substance use is a lot higher in LGBTQ teens. And a lot of that does just come back from our family of origin and how we feel as an individual, if we're accepted or if we're not accepted, because we live in a heteronormative society and a cisgendered society, which means that we see those things every day in the sense of what's normal. And so if you don't fit into those paradigms, then you're sort of by default thinking not normal, and that's definitely not the case. I think if you could scroll
Delaney,
down.
I just wanted to add to the idea of acceptance. One of the things that I've learned as a parent is that acceptance is not kind of a one-time deal. It's kind of a process that people go through, and your kid's going through a process, and you're kind of going through a process too. And one of the things I have learned is that just saying, you know, I accept you, there's so much more to really growing in your acceptance of your kid. For example, like, are you really listening to them? You know, are you creating this space where they're free to talk about what they're feeling and kind of show you, are you making room for them to really show you who they are? So it's definitely a process. I think maybe at the beginning, I thought of acceptance in a little bit more of a simplistic fashion. I also think personally, I didn't really know what I didn't know. And so part of acceptance too is taking it upon yourself to educate yourself a little bit to find out what you don't know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that actually goes perfect into kind of the next things that I wanted to share with you guys. This again is family rejection, but if you want to keep scrolling down, this is just a really quick overview of this in case anybody in the audience doesn't necessarily know what some of these things stand for. That's okay. I'm not going to spend too much time on this piece specifically. But the acronym LGBTQIA+, and there's other acronyms that'll be a little bit longer. This is the one I'm most familiar with and comfortable speaking on, the one I use, so I'm using that. But the L stands for lesbian, G stands for gay, B stands for bisexual, T stands for trans or transgender. The Q will often stand for queer or questioning. I stands for intersex. I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. A can stand for asexual, aromantic, androgynous. And then the plus is inclusive of all other identities that might not be represented either by a letter, such as pansexual, demisexual, gender nonconforming, non-binary, gender fluid. There's a lot of different terms that encompass this sort of umbrella. And if there are any that you're not familiar with, I would encourage you to simply use Google and figure out what it is and learn some more. If anyone has any specific questions about this, feel free to drop them in the Q&A and we can talk about that. But that's kind of the general umbrella. And then if you scroll down a little bit more for me, Bonnie. This is a tool that has been really helpful in having conversations just with my own peers and colleagues and with youth too. One of the things that I think is so hard about living in a heteronormative cisgendered society is that sometimes you just simply didn't know there was other options or there was other things to consider and other points, you know, that you might have had that thought of like, you know, I think I might like this type of person, or I might feel this way, or I really don't feel like this sort of matches until you've had that presented to you to sort of validate that. It just is a completely different experience. So this is a tool that's been developed by, I believe, a local college, and has been really useful. It's kind of evolved throughout the years. At one point, it started with a gingerbread person, but gingerbread people are also kind of falling in that cisgenderedness. So they've moved it to a unicorn. But what this sort of tries to highlight and show you is there's multiple pieces and avenues that this might play out in a person's life. It's not just necessarily like you're gay. Like that's just not very narrow track potentially. And all of it is on a spectrum. So trying to get away from the binary, and binary meaning two, like we only have two options. So you can see each of these has kind of a spectrum or arrows aside from the sex assigned at birth. So gender identity is the top one. It's what the unicorn is kind of thinking. Gender identity is what you internally perceive as yourself, whether that is female, woman, girl, male, man, or boy, or potentially another gender. And it's also a spectrum. So some people might feel like they align more with masculine, or they might align more with feminine. It's not necessarily you're this or this. It could be fluid. It can move around. It can be a whole bunch of different things. So it's not just one or the other. So gender expression is kind of furthering that on what you choose to present on the outside. And for some folks, they might not present on the outside for a lot of different reasons. Sometimes it's safety, sometimes it's not feeling comfortable, but what you sort of choose to wear. And because we do operate in this sort of binary, there's sort of the feminine and then the masculine. I always just think about as, you know, if they're clothes, whoever's wearing them and what they sort of choose to wear can sort of dictate what if it's masculine or feminine or neither or other, or a mix of the two. So the gender expression, which is very different than sex and sexuality. So we have gender, which is kind of how you sort of identify internally, and then how you choose to show it externally. A sex signed at birth is, you know, a baby is born and a doctor looks at it and they're like, you're either A, B, or C. And A, B, or C is female, male, or intersex or other, usually meaning it's unclear to the doctor what you are, so they give you that label. And so this is a label that's assigned to us at birth. Everybody gets one, and sometimes that does not match with how an individual might feel, and because those are assigned to our genitalia. So as you can see, there's a little DNA in the unicorn's crotch area, I guess, for lack of a better term. And then we have physical attraction. So physical attraction is where you kind of get into that sexuality piece of like, who would I like to have an intimate relationship and connection with on a sexual level? And that can be, again, it's a spectrum. It can be men, it can be women, it can be other, it can be all of those, it could be none of those, it could be a bunch of different things. It's really up to the person to decide and how they feel. And there's a lot of moving pieces with that. You know, in previous terms I'd mentioned, you know, pansexual is usually used for like an all-inclusive term. And then you also have folks who identify as bisexual. There's some, you know, debate in the community of whether or not by saying bisexual, it kind of holds up the two gender binary, or if pansexual is more inclusive. There's a lot of details to it. So again, I encourage you, if some of these terms are unfamiliar to you, of looking them up and just kind of exploring and figuring out, hey, what does this mean? Especially if it relates to someone in your own life. Again, thinking about how this is very similar to race and race conversations. It would not be appropriate for me as a white individual to go up to my Black colleague and say, hey, please explain to me how the death of George Floyd has impacted you as a person. That would be very inappropriate for me, and I should go to the internet or to a white peer and say, hey. So similar to like if you have a youth who says, hey, I'm pansexual, and you're like, oh, okay, I don't know what that means, but I'm gonna figure that out. Or if you know, I'll come back, okay, and then figure out on your own, educate yourself, and then come back to the youth and say, hey, I learned some stuff about being bisexual or pansexual. I did some research. And then, you know, if you have that relationship with the youth, you could be like, I'm wondering, what does that look like for you specifically? Because this is what I learned, this is what I know, and how is that impacting you, or how can I support you? So that you're not putting the burden on the person to explain who they are. Because I'm sure it would be really awkward if I walked up to you, Bonnie, and I was like, Bonnie, please explain to me why you're a female. Like, why are you like, what does it mean to be female to you, Bonnie? I don't know what that means. That'd be weird and awkward potentially. And also like, it seems like I'm also doubting your existence, right? Of like, I don't know what that means. And now again, this is a conversation you tread carefully, or not carefully, but you know, you should approach it in ways that make it seem comfortable to you. Some people in the LGBTQ community might be willing to share that with you and explain that to you, but don't assume that somebody is willing to share and explain that to you. And then emotionally attracted to, again, is another sort of spectrum of men, women, other genders. This is where you kind of get into the difference between being physically attracted and emotionally attracted. So some individuals don't feel sort of the sexual attraction to other people, and that's where you have asexual individuals, or like aromantic individuals might not feel romantic attachments to individuals, but they'll feel sexual attraction to individuals. Again, all of this is dependent on the individual. So just kind of wanted to give you guys a rundown of that in case anybody needed to be caught up to speed, or give this to you as a resource in order to have conversations with other people in your life of what it might look like. Yeah. Any questions or comments about that you wanted to add, Bonnie? I don't know if I can.
Yeah, I don't think so. I think sometimes when you're talking about communicating with your kid, you know your kid. And so if you think that if they seem pretty comfortable, you might ask them if they feel comfortable answering a question, but that extra bit of kindness to ask if they feel comfortable, because even if they seem like a super confident kid, this might be an area that's particularly sensitive for them. So just recognizing that, I would say, and just ask if they feel comfortable. And if they don't, like to give them that space to define for themselves what they feel comfortable with and what they don't, talking to you. Because even if they're not the ones to tell you, you've got, there's a lot of other resources, and we'll share some of those with you tonight that you can go and find out on your own. You don't necessarily have to have your kid explain it to you, especially, to pressure them before they're ready to share it with you.
Yep. Which I think goes into, oh yeah, here's some more resources. We'll talk a little bit about that later as well. But yeah, so gender expression and pronouns is another thing that often comes up as a theme for spaces that feel a little bit uncomfortable or people are unsure about, especially just sometimes people are unfamiliar with simply like, I started saying, my name is Delaney and I use she, her pronouns. That's something that might be new to folks. I think it's something that's being more used widely now. People put it in their email signatures or on their name tags. And that's a way to sort of show, hey, this is how I identify. If you identify in a way, I will respect that and use those pronouns. And it also takes some practice too, especially English language isn't the best in terms of singular non-gendered pronouns. So we use they, them as the preferred way for most individuals. Again, always asking what's most preferred from the person. So we had some sort of questions that we've heard before that wanted to just use this as a way to sort of start us off in each of these topics of, my 15-year-old child who's born female told us that they are non-binary and want us to use they, them pronouns. I don't really understand what non-binary means and they don't want to talk about it. It feels awkward to refer to my child this way. In a way, it feels like a negation of the relationship I thought I had with my daughter. What should I do? So one of the first things you can do is to get a better understanding of what non-binary might mean, just in general as a term, looking that up. And then also figuring out how that sort of relates to your child. If they want to use the pronouns they, them, pronouns, again, like I said, they take practice and people will mess up. I've definitely messed up. And the most important thing is not to make a big deal about the fact that you messed up. It's to just kind of keep moving forward and, apologize like, oh, I'm sorry, I sorry. And then, re-say your sentence with the correct pronoun or whatever it was that you were saying, and then just kind of move forward because the focus isn't on that you messed up, it's that you're changing your behavior and moving forward. So that can often be something that's challenging, as well as the relationship piece. I think parents, and that's another common thing I've heard too, is that parents feel like the LGBTQ sort of status or change in their child has just greatly, hugely, vastly changed their relationships and who your child is. And really, working with the kids that I've worked with, it doesn't really change sort of that much. I mean, it does and it doesn't. Like, your child is still your child that you've raised and helped and, nurtured and, kissed the bruises and like whatever it might be. They're still that same person, just because a fraction of their identity is different now in your eyes that you might not have known before. That doesn't necessarily mean they're this entirely new person. I mean, like thinking about, you know, how our bodies even work, like there's some stat of like your skin is never actually the same after so many years, like your whole skin regrows, like you're still you though, like just even though your skin didn't regrow, like it regrew to different skin. Um, so just kind of thinking about what is it as a parent that might be bringing up that sort of fear or just uncertainty or the unknown, and really sitting with that, because that's again similar to like the race conversation. That's work that we need to do as adults, and not the work that our youth that we work with need to do. It's the work that we need to sit with and figure out what that sort of means. And that could be a variety of different things. Like I said, education, also reaching out to other parents that might be in the have similar experiences, and just sort of also figuring out how to normalize this and normalize it in your own life and the life of your teen.
Yeah. So I guess what I would add to that is, and this is something that I have learned, is when you have that conversation with your child, be mindful of the way that you interact with them. And that is, like, you might have all kinds of doubts. And I've talked to other parents too, who start off with, I don't understand this, and you know, this is bad grammar and things like that. And those, your feelings are completely valid. But I think it's helpful, if you can, to take a minute to just, you know, sort of recognize what you're feeling, and maybe sort of also stop and think about your kid's experience. And it could be quite difficult for them to share this with you. It could be an awkward thing to talk about. And, you know, think about what they probably are looking for or needing from you in that interaction. Because, you know, there's a good chance it's you know, some patience and some acceptance and some validation of their of what they're sharing, and also a little bit of, you know, some room for them to sort of figure this out and try things out.
Yeah, exactly. Which is similar to sort of the next theme of like conversations and trust, and how do you build that. So another scenario we had kind of talked through is that you find out that your family, from a family friend, that you find out that your 13-year-old son is gay. He hasn't come out to the family yet. We're an accepting family, and we want him to know that we accept this about him. Should we let him know what we know, or wait for him to feel comfortable telling us? This is a thing that I'm sure lots of LGBTQ parents have encountered, and also just individuals as well, like adults and teens as well. You'll like hear something about another person, and they'll be like, oh yeah, so and so's gay, like I didn't know that about them. And that just is such a weird part of it all, of like, how do we sort of navigate this? And as parents, my suggestion would be a couple of things. The first one is, I would personally suggest waiting for your youth to come to you, because they felt comfortable sharing this to their family friend, which is awesome. It means they're talking about it and feeling like they can be in safe spaces. And they might not be sharing with you, not because they're feeling like they're intentionally hurting your feelings, but they might not be sharing because they don't feel either safe, or they don't know how you'll react, or they're not ready yet, because there's a lot that comes with that, or the sort of coming out experience, which is unique to everybody in the LGBTQ community and how they experience it. It's just something also unique in the sense that, like, again, we live in a heteronormative world, and we don't just like, we just assume then that the default is straight, and we don't ever have to have our straight colleagues like come out and be like, oh, I'm so sorry, or I just want you to know I'm straight. Like, that just would be odd. And so it sometimes feels odd that these are conversations people have to have, and it's, you know, part of our identities or their identities, and it's important. So one of the ways that you could, if this was a situation that you were in, is trying to figure out how can you normalize this in your own home. And a lot of times we don't know what people are thinking or feeling or reacting to certain ways until we hear them say it and we're given opportunities. So another example, and I know I keep relating it back to the conversations of race that I know many people are having right now. I was emailing somebody earlier this week, and they're like, oh, how are you doing? And I had said, you know, I just spent some time emailing my council members, you know, about Black Lives Matter. And I just like said a statement about that. You know, I wasn't expecting them to respond, or like, you know, it wasn't like charged in any way. I was just like, hey, that's what I was doing. But because I said that and I did that, it allowed my coworker to see like, oh, okay, I see where she's at. Okay, I feel like I can actually maybe bring in something to this, or I can engage with her on this topic because she clearly is like at least open to bringing it up. And wants to just say out there like, hey, kind of this is, this is where I stand. I wasn't like super specific on like all my list of like what I feel and how I feel about Black Lives Matter, but I was just like, hey, Black Lives Matter. And then she was able to choose to engage or not choose to engage. That's up to each individual person. So thinking about what are ways in our homes in general, because even if you're on this call and you don't have an LGBTQ youth, you should still be kind of thinking about this and how do you normalize it and how do you bring it into your home, because LGBTQ people exist, LGBTQ people are not going away, and how do we sort of make it so people feel comfortable, whether or not it's your own youth or your youth's friend or even a relative that you might not know. So one way that you can do that is by having those kind of conversations. So say you're watching a movie or a TV show or whatnot, and the episode ends, you're watching with your youth and you're like, oh, hey, character B is, pansexual. I'm totally okay with that. I think it's interesting how it, whatever plays out in the show, or, maybe it doesn't play out well in the show. I'm not sure. There's could be a lot that you could talk about with that. Be like, what do you think about it? Not even knowing, it doesn't matter if your youth is LGBTQ or not. It's probably good to know where they think you stand on these conversations, because again, I think adults, and it's something that we do in all forms of everything that I've ever encountered in my professional counseling career, we just kind of sometimes assume that the youth know where we stand. Like I'll talk to parents about like marijuana, and I'll be like, oh, so how does your youth know where you stand on marijuana and if they were to smoke pot? And the parents are just like, oh, I just know that they know I would not be okay with it. I'd be like, okay, well, like, what did that conversation look like? Like, how have you shown them that or told them that or had a conversation about it? And they're like, oh, they just would know. They would know they'd be in trouble. I'm like, well, would they? Because you haven't talked about it. Like, they might think you're on the other, they might think you think it's like, okay. Like, you don't know. And that's the same thing too with this sort of topic of we want to bring it up. And sometimes it's a lot easier to bring it up when it's not as sensitive or relevant or in your kind of face. Again, like a lot of people are talking about race right now. I'm sure lots of people brought it up before this, but now it's kind of in our face. And so we're needing to learn and grow and engage with it. So it might actually be easier to be talking about LGBTQ with youth before you have to sort of think about that. And it also just shows to them, if they are, that they can talk to you about it, which is just really important, I think, with parents and opening and establishing trust, which is super, super hard as a parent. So yeah.
All right, should we move on to the next one?
Sure, yeah. So the other sort of topic that it does play into this as well, and having conversations, is dating and relationships. So this kind of scenario is my 15-year-old son hid the fact that he was bisexual and having a relationship with a much older 3.5 years old boy of many months. When we found out about it, he was mad and has been distant and oppositional ever since. We're concerned about the age difference and between him and his boyfriend. We're fine with his sexual orientation. What can we do to improve our relationship with our son without sacrificing our values around appropriate rules for dating? And this just goes back again to having conversations with it, setting clear boundaries about what dating looks like, regardless of if your youth is LGBTQ or not. It would be the same scenario if your son was dating a girl or female identified individual 3.5 years older than them. That would still be something that you as a parent are probably concerned about, especially also just thinking about ages of consent and what that means. And that similar to, straight youth, you need to have the conversations about dating, and you need to have the conversations about safe sex and what safe sex looks like and what do healthy relationships look like, because it's information that all youth need to know at some point. And it's better to figure that out sooner rather than later in terms of where you feel comfortable talking to them about it. Or if you're not, figuring out ways that they can get that information from a reputable source. There's a lot of great resources in our community in terms of the various teen centers and teen health centers. There's one over in Eastgate, Bellevue that's phenomenal, and teens can go in and get all sorts of things that they might need. And I know the staff there are all well educated on LGBTQ youth and like how sex looks different if it's a female identified person and a female identified person versus a male identified and a male identified, or all of the other things that we've talked about so far. And so just really knowing where you stand and making that really clear with the youth, regardless of LGBTQ or who they're dating and what the relationship sort of looks like. Yeah.
I guess what I would add to that is thinking about this relationship, I would say, you know, kind of work on the relationship. It's hard if you can engage your son with conversations about their feelings and really do some listening. If they're willing to share how they're feeling, you can maybe try to get, you know, show some empathy toward that experience, because there's probably something in there that you could agree with, and see if you can work on getting on the same side, because, you know, it's fair and fine for parents to have these boundaries and rules, but if you can communicate to your kid that those rules are not, you know, they're not specific to your kid, if because they're gay or bisexual in this case, yeah, that can really help to try to put you in a position where your kid is maybe feeling safer with you and better able to and more inclined to share his experience, which is kind of, as a parent, I think it's kind of where you want to be. You want to be someone that they can trust and someone that they can feel safe sharing things with, so that they'll come to you if they need something.
Yeah, and that's one of the things I think is a common struggle with parents, regardless of how their youth identify, is how do you build these safe spaces and conversations to have between you and the young people in your life. So I appreciate this, Paula, because you're able, or sorry, not Paula, Bonnie, you're able to sort of reframe for me, I'm not a parent. I just work with the youth as an adult in their lives. So I definitely appreciate that and your insight as well. And then I think the last one that I had that I wanted to just connect with and talk to you guys about is social media and the internet, and how that is such a huge space these days. And it's very, very different. I mean, if we were to think about what the community was like, you know, even just 15, 20 years ago, it's so different now. I mean, one of the like fun tidbits that I know is that like people used to like write stories and have like magazines that they would send each other. That was how they would like communicate about certain things, or like, you know, just newspapers and whatnot. And there was just sort of these niche publications that you could subscribe to, and that was how people found their community. And actually, fun fact, it was also centered around Star Trek with Kirk and Spock. It was like a big thing in the 60s, and that was how people got kind of their information and got how they would talk and communicate with other people, as well as other ways, you know, like pride celebrations being one of them, and certain places and communities. I mean, you know, Capitol Hill historically has been that sort of gathering space for Seattle, as well as other spaces and communities. But now the internet and social media is so huge as a space. And that's where a lot of youth get information. And again, like when I was talking about the gender unicorn, you know, you don't know until you've seen it or you're exposed to it, and that it's an option. And so that's where a lot of youth will find community and find about these identities that they may have, which is a really great thing. And it's also really challenging for parents to navigate too, because you're not necessarily going to operate in those spaces as well, or even know those spaces exist, and just being mindful of that. And again, it's having conversations about social media and internet and boundaries and whatnot, and just kind of being as aware as you can of like where your youth are going and what they're doing, because finding community is really, really, really important. And kind of one of the things I think has been the hardest in terms of quarantine right now is, again, it's June. Like if normal things were happening, I'm just looking at the calendar, like the Pride Parade would be this weekend, and that just is so like, I'm like, my people. And so finding that community is really important, and figuring out how you can support that with your youth or youth in your life, of like where can they go for information that's accurate and helpful, and also where can they find representation too. So that's another thing I'm really passionate about, is stories and representation. And it's really, really important for people to see themselves reflected in TV shows and movies and books and whatnot. And there's so much more out there now which is really awesome. And some of the resources that I wanted to provide to you guys that were earlier up in the slides are just lists of movies and books and things that cover LGBTQ lives and experiences, because sometimes, again, it's also very narrow in the sense of like, this is all that makes up this one person, is this identity or this letter. And that's not the case. You know, people are thriving, complex, messy individuals, and we want to be able to see that, right? We want to see accurate representation, not sort of the tokenism. And again, I just keep thinking about how it relates back to, you know, race and racism, because that's another identity, and there's intersectionality between the two, and how that's super, super important. And we're moving forward very, very slowly. And you know, also quickly in the same, you know, I was personally really excited when there was the two women that kissed in Star Wars, in the last Star Wars movie, and I was like, woohoo, gay people in space. And there's still a lot more. So that's another thing important for parents to be thinking about, is what media are you connected to? What are you seeing? What is your youth seeing? And then what can you also bring into your home? I mean, is it a movie you watch together? Is it a book you read together? Is it a TV show that has kind of complex, diverse characters? What is it, so that you can have these conversations, again, even if your youth isn't LGBTQ, if they are or not, to sort of foster this community that we all want in our lives. So those were the main kind of themes and topics I wanted to talk on. I thought we would talk through that a lot quicker, but there's just so much. So I'm not sure if there's questions in the Q&A or not, whatnot.
I don't see any questions, but we're...
I covered it all.
Yeah, no, please take a few minutes here to pause and digest and think about if you've got something that you wanted to comment on or ask a question about. Go ahead and type that in the Q&A. We still have a few more minutes to see what's on your mind and what brought you here.
Yeah, and if you don't feel comfortable with that as well, I have given my email address. If anybody that is participating wants to send me an email of if they have questions, or they're like, hey, can you point me to a certain space or whatnot, I'm happy to do that in the capacity, in the sense that I'm not going to be your counselor or therapist, or the counselor or therapist for your child. That would not be appropriate, but I am happy to point you in the right direction. If you guys need that or don't feel comfortable necessarily putting that in the comments or chats, feel free to email me and I can point you where you want to go.
Are there no questions, or still don't have anything?
We got a long comment. Okay. So I'll just kind of read it out loud. Sometimes I think we should start having these conversations with our kids way before they start discovering who they really are. I keep telling my tween that even though I talk from my point of view, which is a heterosexual marriage, that when she starts falling in love in a year or a few years, it's important that they are nice to her and they feel a good person, whether or not they're black, white, boy, or a girl. We're super lucky that we have a family of friends whose father transitioned to a mother, and then the poly family for a while too, so we have a point of reference. Yeah, I definitely agree with that, and again, normalizing it too in whatever way you can, and some of that is just using really inclusive language. One of the things I try to make in my own personal practice is when I'm talking to somebody about a spouse or a loved one or a partner, of using those terms and not assuming that you have a husband if you look like a woman. And then I shouldn't even then assume that you identify as a woman just by looking at you. So just thinking about how can you be more inclusive with language and talking through that. And that's awesome that you're thinking about that already with your tween. And I think that's totally true. We should have these conversations sooner rather than later. Yeah, it looks like it's pretty quiet.
I can't see the chat. Is there anything else?
No, we just got to thank you for the conversation and resources. Good stuff to digest and continue learning.
Okay, well, you're taking the last few minutes to think if you might have a question. We've got a poll that we'd like to put up there and let you guys give us a little feedback on what topics you might be interested in seeing from us in the future. So we'll go ahead and launch the poll, and you guys can give us that feedback while you're thinking things over. Delaney, did you have any final words for us? Any thoughts that you want to share?
And just kind of what we've talked about already is, thank you guys for being here and wanting to have the conversation. And, sometimes it is uncomfortable, challenging what we think and what we know, and that might be different from ourselves. I know one topic we didn't bring up, because it can be kind of one of the most touchy topics, which now I'm thinking about it, maybe we should have brought it up. It's just the aspect of religion and how that has been a major player in LGBTQ communities, and how some communities are accepting and not accepting, and sort of what that looks like and plays out, and how that's really changed too. And for that, I definitely would encourage folks to look at some of the resources provided you with. PFLAG, there's a PFLAG Eastside, so specifically for Bellevue and our side of the area. PFLAG has a bunch of resources, including faith-based resources for how to have those conversations, not necessarily with your teen or the youth, but how to have close conversations yourself and learn for yourself and talk about that with other parents that might be in similar spaces, because that's been a big tension point. But again, thank you guys for being here and wanting to learn and grow and potentially be in spaces that are uncomfortable, because we have to be in those spaces to do that, to learn and move forward.
Yeah, I would say as a parent, this can be hard. It can be hard to parent in this space. Not that there aren't moments of joy, and sometimes it's tempting to really dwell on the problems and how hard things can be. And it's, I've personally found it's important to really intentionally make time to really make sure that you're appreciating your kid as just your kid, and that you're doing fun things together and celebrating them, even while you're trying to work through some of the hard stuff. But it can be hard, and I just want to express appreciation to all the parents out there who are in it and they're trying. And if you're open and don't be afraid to make mistakes. You're going to make mistakes. I've made so many mistakes, but if you stick in it and you let your kid know that you love them and you're going through this process with them together, I think that the relationship can actually grow as you work through some of these challenges together. All right, so
Bonnie, can I mention next week's webinar really quickly?
yes, please do.
So next week we have someone coming in from Yale, and we are doing, it's a focus on happiness, but we're calling a holding space for yourself and your children. Her name is Tracy, and she is a fantastic presenter. So I hope that some of you can join us for next week. And of course, if you can't, we will record it and make that available. Same for tonight's presentation. We will be putting it up in Facebook and then on our YouTube channel. So feel free to share it with people that you know could benefit from this amazing information that Delaney's provided for us.
All right, thank you. I can't see the slides anymore. Is there anything else that we need to say in terms of announcements, Sherry?
I think that's it. We should also probably mention that we are doing through Instagram a similar support, presentations on Instagram Live, and they're changing it up a little bit, but you can hear from teens, and I believe sometimes there's counselors on there with them. But if you have a teen, or even if you want to learn from teens and what they're going through, it is BIM Teens, BIMTEENS, and I believe it's Tuesday at 4 or 4:30. I don't exactly remember. It's on one of those slides you have, Bonnie, but if you can't access that, it's also on our Facebook group, and I would highly encourage everyone to join that Facebook group. We'll continue to put information there and continue this conversation there as well.
All right. Well, thank you so much for being with us this evening. It's been enlightening. Thank you so much, Delaney, for being here with us tonight. It was a good conversation. I hope that everyone took away a little something to think about tonight.